The Samsung Galaxy S8 was one of the earliest phones to push the envelope in shrinking bezels, coming out in early 2017. And even to this day, it's not hard to call this a good-looking phone. But even with a gorgeous display and still decent hardware, the phone is 4 years old, and already 2 versions behind when it comes to Android support. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and the Samsung Galaxy S8 and S8 Plus don't really feel their age, and yet they kind of do. How did they hold up in 2021, and could it even be worth buying? Could the Galaxy S8 be worth buying? Probably not, but also maybe. On eBay.com, used or refurbished, you can find it for around $100, and anything under $100 for the S8, or more specifically the S8 Plus for a slightly better battery, is just a heck of a deal. On the surface, this phone is fantastic. It feels amazing in the hand, and looks even better, especially from the front, with admittedly older hardware that does still manage to hold its own, mostly. But the problem? The software. It's stuck forever on Android 9 and an older version of One UI from Samsung, cursed to never receive major updates ever again as it slowly fades into irrelevancy. Where this phone's potential lies is, in my opinion, rooting and flashing it with a custom ROM. If you go to the effort of installing Lineage OS or something to that extent, you can run a clean version of Android 11, and because the hardware is still pretty decent, the phone should run fairly well. It might slow down a bit, but having the newest Android features might be worth it for you. That being said, for the vast majority of people out there, a custom ROM is not the answer. Heck, most people don't know what that is, and that is totally fine. If you're the kind of person who would rather a phone to just work and work well out of the box, the S8 can be that, but just keep in mind you're not going to have a lot of the newer features and software you'd get with a better phone. But it's cheap, so it might be worth it for you. Battery life is likely going to be rough, you'll run into a bit of lag here and there, and the camera at best is pretty mediocre. The thing the S8 really has going for it is the design and the amazing display. It really does look fantastic, even now, at least to my eyes. So let's start this off by talking about the design a bit more in depth. We have a glass back and aluminum frame and a fingerprint sensor beside the single camera lens. I like the look of this phone from the back, but that fingerprint sensor is actually a huge sore spot of this phone. While it does a fine job in unlocking your phone, the placement is just awful, and I find myself tapping the camera more often than the sensor, at least on my first attempt. It's something you can get used to, but the S9 did fix it by placing the sensor underneath the camera, making it more obvious and natural to the touch. Just an annoyance worth mentioning. There are other biometrics to get into your phone, such as iris scanning and basic facial recognition, if you'd prefer to use those, although neither are super secure. The phone really does look spectacular from the back, and there's a good few colors to help it feel like your own. It's all in all pretty thin and light feeling, which makes it comfortable to hold and actually use. The glass back also allows for wireless charging, and of course fast charging is an option, and we do have water resistance with this phone. Also an essential Samsung inclusion, you do have the option to add a micro SD card for cheap extra storage. On the bottom of the phone we get USB-C as well as the headphone jack, a commodity no longer being included on newer Galaxies, despite Samsung being one of the last companies to hang on to it. There are 2 models of this phone, the Galaxy S8 and S8 Plus. Besides the Plus being bigger, the phones are basically the same. No extra camera lens on the back or anything like that, and I have the Plus here. I'd say the reason to go for the Plus, besides the larger screen, is a larger battery, which should translate to some more life day to day, although because the phones are older, the battery life might not hold up regardless, depending on how much they've been used over the years. What more than holds up though is the AMOLED Infinity displays. The Galaxy S8 features a 5.8-inch screen with a resolution of 2960 by 1440, making for a pixel density of 570 pixels per inch. The S8 Plus boasts a 6.2-inch screen with the same resolution, although because the phone is bigger, it does mean a slightly worse 529 pixels per inch. That's still an insane number, and while the smaller S8 is technically a bit sharper, there's no way you would notice in day-to-day use. The screens have the prestigious title of Infinity Display because the screen kind of curves over the edges, which gives the impression of little to no side bezel, and in my opinion is super aesthetically pleasing, at least to look at. In real life use, I'm actually not a fan. The lack of side bezel means it's pretty easy for accidental touches, and light tends to reflect down the edges in a way that wouldn't happen normally. It can be a bit distracting. Regardless, it does look cool, and as with anything, it would be something that I would get used to. Plus, since the phones have a glass back, you should really be using a case, and that would solve the accidental touch issue. Because the displays are Super AMOLED, we get true blacks and crazy vivid colors, making looking for a sharp, clear, gorgeous image that looks about as good as what phones are coming out with today. While there are bezels on the top and bottom of the phone versus basically none on newer Galaxies, beyond that with the S8 there's really not much to indicate you're holding a 4-year-old phone. It looks and feels terrific, and the only thing dragging it down when you start using it tends to be the software. Well, that and the camera. Not that it's necessarily bad. The S8 has a rear 12 megapixel camera that isn't really much upgraded from the S7 and can shoot decent photos. With good lighting you can get some nice shots, and it's in lower light conditions you might have some issues. Overall though, as you can see here, there's not too much to say. There's potential for nice pictures, and I'm guessing anybody looking into actually buying the S8 nowadays isn't expecting a top of the line camera. It looks like a 2017 smartphone camera, and that's all there is to it. Video can be filmed in up to 4K at 30 frames per second, which is pretty standard. Looking at the front camera, we get a healthy count of 8 megapixels, and selfies are pretty mediocre but will do the job. For Zoom or Snapchat or whatever, it's gonna be fine in my opinion. I've talked about the battery a bit, but let's look at the specifics. The S8 and S8 Plus have 3000 and 3500 milliamp hour batteries respectively, and both phones should be able to get you the day, at least ideally. Although because these phones are both 4 years old, if they've been used regularly over the years, there's a good chance they're gonna struggle in this department. The S8 Plus should be better in theory, but both phones have the potential to be pretty bad. That's kind of the risk you're gonna have to take with an older phone like this, and if you're personally using an S8 with a bad battery, it might just be time to consider upgrading to a new phone altogether. You're a couple versions behind on Android anyways, and trust me when I say newer phones have gotten a lot better, particularly in the camera department. Despite the lack of software support, the hardware actually isn't too bad. In North American and East Asian markets, you're looking at the Snapdragon 835 chipset along with 4 GB of RAM, pretty typical specs for 2017, and it's enough to give you a decent experience in 2021, at least in most everyday scenarios. There's going to be some lag and slowdowns here and there, and apps aren't going to stay open in the background as long as they could on a newer phone, but from my limited testing, it feels good enough to be used regularly without much frustration. If you're not in the markets mentioned, you'll have the Exynos 8895 chipset, which should offer similar performance, although the Snapdragon does seem to be a bit faster. There also seems to be a 6 gigs of RAM version of the S8 offered internationally. Doesn't seem to be in Canada where I live, and I'd imagine the small bump up in RAM wouldn't actually make much of a difference in real life use, so there's not really much point of looking for that one specifically. Swiping around One UI 1.0 feels good enough, although I absolutely despise the skin Samsung puts over all their phones. It's not how it looks necessarily, but more about the weird quirks and bloat that they always include. You have double versions of a lot of apps, like 2 browsers, 2 gallery apps, etc. I wish companies could just let you use Google's apps and not bother trying to replace them. The S8's best feature has always been the display, but funnily enough, it comes with a resolution selected at 1080p. This would be mostly to save battery life, but the problem here is many people likely don't know their phone is not even running at its own potential, despite how much money they paid, probably in part because of the display. It's ironic, but I do get it. Another little quirk is that Samsung actively bugs you if you turn your brightness too high by turning the bar red, because again, probably battery life, and also I'd say burn-in might be a factor. It's understandable, but I don't know, I don't really like that they actively discourage you from using your phone at its full potential. But screen burn-in. Screen burn-in is a real issue with any OLED panel, and it's not a problem unique to this phone by any means. It's better than it used to be. Older Samsungs, for example, used to be much worse, but it still is a problem. Look around on the used market and you'll see many examples of burn-in. In fact, my Galaxy S9 Plus actually has some burn-in, and it's basically when a single image has stayed on the screen for too long, it can leave a permanent trace of it afterwards. Turning up the contrast on this clip of my S9 here, you can see the keyboard is visible despite me actually being on a blank white page. This isn't uncommon, and it is something to watch out for. Minor burn-in is pretty unnoticeable in most circumstances, but some unscrupulous sellers on eBay and the like may downplay the actual damage, so stay on the lookout. Also, just don't leave your phone on a single image for too long because it could burn in. At the end of the day, the Galaxy S8 and S8 Plus are phones that still hold up in hardware, but had their lives artificially cut short due to the unfortunate lack of software support. And that rhymed. There's no excuse, and unless you're the type of person to go through the trouble of setting up a custom ROM, I just can't recommend buying this phone for most people. If you have one right now, I don't think you need to upgrade by any means. Despite it being behind in software, it can still download any app and do most things you'd want it to. If your phone is feeling the age though, maybe it's a bit slow or the battery life is lackluster, there is always the option of upgrading to a newer Galaxy or even looking elsewhere on the Android or iPhone market. So basically, if you own one right now, you're probably okay, but I wouldn't buy one unless you're finding a heck of a deal and you're willing to live with the downsides. This is a good phone, but it used used to be a great one. And you know what, at around $100, it's still pretty darn good value in 2021. Just probably not a phone most people should actually buy anymore, even if it does manage to hold up in the areas that for some might just count the most. But what do you think? Any of you out there still have the Galaxy S8? How's it working for you? Make sure you let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting or helpful, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like to for some reason. And with that all being said, thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91tech, and I will see you all next time.